So you've stumbled upon this channel, or maybe you've heard about this whole grain milling thing due to other people talking about it or 2020 craziness or whatever. But you have no idea why anyone would go through the trouble of milling their own wheat and baking bread from scratch. After all, we have bread in the store, or maybe you've bought into the lie that bread is absolute poison and that you should stay away from it. In this video, I'm going to share with you why you and pretty much nearly everyone else should be milling their own grains, baking their own bread, and consuming it on a daily basis, just like humanity has done for thousands of years. Hey everyone, welcome back to Grains and Grit. My name is Felicia, and on this channel we talk about all things real whole grains from a biblical perspective. If you notice, we're in a different setting than my normal videos because I wanted to sit down and basically just have a little chat with you about why we should be milling our own grains. What is the big deal about milling grains, consuming whole grains? Why is it such a big deal? I've dedicated an entire YouTube channel to it. And the answer really is because it is a huge deal, and we're going to be discussing why in this video. So pour yourself a cup of coffee or tea. I have my coffee, shameless plug, in my I Need Bread mug that I have in my merch store. And then we're going to be talking and we're going to have a little chat about why this is so important. In this video, I'm going to be talking about what makes freshly milled flour different than the store-bought flour you find in the store, why freshly milled is best, the difference between home milled whole grain flour versus stone grind mill flour that you can actually purchase already milled, and fourth, why you should be eating bread made from freshly milled grains every single day. Now with this video, I actually thought about just really scripting it out where I have every single little bullet point, and I decided not to do that beyond the basic 4 topics that we're going to be talking about. When I asked my husband exactly what I should cover in this video, he said, well, basically just cover what you would say when someone comes to you at maybe a fellowship or at the homeschool co-op or wherever, and they ask you, hey, what's the big deal about milling grains? And then you tell them why. So that's basically what we're going to be doing. So first big question, what is the difference between freshly milled flour and the flour you buy from the store? The biggest difference is when you mill your grains at home, you are taking the entire wheat berry, the whole seed that God created for wheat or whatever grain that you are milling, and you are taking that entire seed and turning it into flour. In that seed is all the nutrients it needs. Wheat is the king of grains. It contains 40 out of 44 essential nutrients that we need to survive. Contrast that to store-bought flour, your typical all-purpose bread flour, whether it be all-purpose, pastry flour, your bread flour, whatever it is in the store that you are typically buying as flour. All that is gluten and starch. What they have done is they have stripped out the wheat germ, which is the oils of the grain, and they have also removed the bran, which is where the fiber and other nutrients live as well. The reason they started doing this way long ago, back in the late 1800s, where we had the big steel rolling mills come out, and they realized, hey, we can strip the germ and the bran and make white flour for the masses. And by the 1920s in the United States, white flour was pretty much available for everyone. The reason that manufacturers did this is because when you strip the germ and the bran, you make the flour more shelf stable. That's by removing the germ. And then they removed the bran because it made the flour lighter, fluffier, giving us our white flour, our lighter breads as we know today. Before this became a thing, white flour was considered food for the very, very wealthy for thousands of years. The Bible talks about it in Proverbs when it mentions the king's dainties, how it talks about, how light they look. And that's because first, for 2 reasons. One, the wealthy had servants that could take the time to manually sift the flour on top of having to manually mill the grains into flour. They then had servants that could also take the time to sift the flour to make it lighter and fluffier. The wealthy could also afford to lose about 25% of their crop, because that's how much you lose roughly whenever you are sifting out the bran and the germ. You're losing about 25%. The poor, generally, or middle class, or people who did not have servants to take the time to sift out the wheat, nor did they want to lose 20 to 25% of their crop that they took the time to grow and harvest and everything like that. The poor was considered to have the brown bread, things like that, where the wealthy had their lighter, fluffier breads. So to sum up, the difference between freshly milled flour at home versus store-bought flour is dead flour. There are no nutrients in that flour. All that you have is gluten and starch. And then on top of that, to kind of make a rabbit trail, they then take that just gluten and starch and then make bread from it that you buy in the store. And sometimes they add even more gluten to it. So if you wonder why people have gluten sensitivity, so many people possibly deal with issues with gluten, that is because the flour, the wheat that they are consuming is not real wheat. It is not real bread. It is not the wheat that God created for us to consume. God created the wheat berry to contain the germ and the bran that has all the fiber, all the nutrients, the vitamin E, everything like that to help you digest the gluten that is in there. All this brings us to our second point, why freshly milled flour is best. And I kind of talked about this in the first question. And that's because with freshly milled flour, you're taking the whole wheat berry, you are grinding it all into flour. You're not removing anything. And wheat berries specifically contain 40 out of 44 essential nutrients needed to life. Also with freshly milled flour, you have two things that you do not find in store-bought flour, and that is the bran and the germ. So let's break that down. What you find in the bran is pretty much the fiber. That is the stuff that's going to help you digest, keep you not constipated. Constipation is a huge problem in this country, even with children these days. And I thoroughly believe that that is due to the fact that we're not consuming real whole grains that God designed to give us the fiber that we need. And on top of that, most people just aren't consuming enough fiber to begin with. But if you really want to intake your fiber, you should be milling your grains, because wow, there is a lot in just a single slice of bread. The second part of that is the germ. Now the germ contains a crucial nutrient that we need. It is the oil part of the wheat berry, and it contains vitamin E. And this is so important because wheat berries contain the most vitamin E out of any other food. It contains about, I'm doing this from memory, but I believe about 147% of your daily needs of vitamin E. Number 2 in the food kingdom is well below 100% of that. I mean, wheat berries blow it out of the water when it comes to vitamin E. Vitamin E is crucial for healing, for our immune systems. You need it for fertility, for so many things. You need the vitamin E. And I find it very interesting that we have so many health issues that can be linked to vitamin E because we've now pretty much eliminated the number one food group that contains it. Also, why freshly milled flour is best is because of nutrients like vitamin E. Whenever you mill it, all of these nutrients are contained in the wheat berry. And like any seed, it contains all the nutrients that it needs to be able to grow, to thrive, to make a healthy plant. Until you actually either sprout it, so you either plant it in the ground for it to turn into a plant, or you somehow crack it open, and in this case, that would be milling the grains. As soon as you crack open that wheat berry, you sprout it or you mill it, it needs to be consumed because now it's starting to be oxidized. And within just 3 days of milling your grains, 90% of nutrients have been oxidized. They are gone forever. And this is why freshly milled at home is so crucial, which we will get to in the next question. The reason that they took out the germ from store-bought flour was because it contains the oils, and that's what makes the flour go bad quicker. It's not as shelf stable. And they took out the bran because they wanted it to be light and fluffy. And also they realized that they could sell the bran to the animal feed industry and kind of double dip into their profits. So again, there really is no competition between freshly milled flour and store-bought flour. Again, store-bought flour, dead flour, freshly milled flour, living flour, because it contains all the nutrients that you need. Contrast to store-bought flour, which is just gluten and starch. That's all you're getting. This brings us to our next question. The difference between freshly milled flour that you have milled yourself at home versus, well, what if I just bought flour that is whole grain that has been milled by someone else? There are companies out there, and kudos to them, trying to redeem this industry, that sell 100% whole grain stone milled flour. It is like the flour, contains all the bran. They haven't sifted it, nothing like that. So why can't you just save the trouble of milling it at home and just buy that? And it's basically because of the reason why I mentioned before. It's just within 90 days of milling your wheat, 90% of nutrients are lost. So even though you are at least getting all the fiber from wheat, from flour that someone else has milled, that is still there because it does still have the bran. A lot of the nutrients have already been lost unless you are using it within 3 days of milling it. But even after day one, you've lost about 45% of your nutrients. I mean, it's fast to oxidize. And so that's why it is best that you take the time, and really it's not that much time, to mill it at home before you bake it, so you can use it as soon as you possibly can. Again, I'm not knocking these companies. I applaud them for at least acknowledging that the flour in the store is not even real flour, that they are at least offering these to people, and some companies offer the bread baked from it as well. But it is definitely best to do it yourself. So the last thing is, not only should you be milling your wheat as opposed to buying store-bought flour or even buying flour that's already been milled that's still whole grain. The crucial thing is this does no good if you do not actually consume it. And I get asked, how often should I be consuming whole grains, bread that I've baked from freshly milled wheat? And I say every single meal, every single day. Grains used to sustain humanity. It was the crop that people relied on because it stores so well. It is the ultimate prepper food as far, with wheat berries, with the whole food, because again, they're seeds and they store easily and they store well. Other videos I've mentioned is the story of Joseph in the Old Testament and the Bible, where God told him that you're going to have 7 years of plenty in Egypt and then 7 years of famine. And so they stored up grains during the 7 years of plenty to carry them through 7 years of really, really bad famine. And not only were they able to feed Egypt, but they were able to feed other nations as well. So that was a big deal. I mean, we don't see in the Bible, how often in the Bible do we see where they ate bread and fish, or they were eating some sort of grain? People come over and someone bakes cakes for them, meaning like some sort of flatbread. Grains were a big deal. God talks about them being in the temple in the Old Testament. They're all over the Bible. And most importantly, Jesus compared himself to bread. He said he was the bread of life. Of all the food groups, he did not say he was the meat of life, not the oil of life, not the butter of life, as amazing as butter is. Jesus is the bread of life, the staple, what's going to sustain your life. Just like bread was what sustained people's life. People knew that if they had a good harvest with their grains, that they would live. And you see grains all over the world in different cultures. When I talk about grains, I'm not necessarily talking about wheat, although wheat is definitely king and the most popular. But look at Latin American countries where their main grain is corn. And they learned to make it more nutritious. So the reason that we should be eating bread for every meal every single day. It's going to fill you up with all that fiber and that goodness. You're going to find yourself not craving as much sugar, not craving the bad stuff. You're going to find yourself where you actually have energy. You're more full because you're actually feeding yourself real food that's going to give you life. And I love what Sue Becker says when people ask her how much bread they should be eating. She asks, well, how much Jesus do you need? And, it's pretty close to it. So hopefully this helps you get a start to this. Now, I will say that all of this can be thrown out the window if you are not a Bible believer. If you are one who believes that we have evolved, that we're just a bunch of chemicals, or you believe that we were first hunter-gatherers, and that's where the carnivore diet comes from and things like that, where that's really how humanity started and we were not meant to consume grains. That is all a lie and it is false, because we know that the Bible says that we were first farmers. God placed us in a garden to tend to it, gave us every herb-bearing seed. Even after the fall, we see that Cain, the son of Adam and Eve, was a tiller of the ground. We have been farmers from the beginning. This is the food that God created us and designed for us to consume for our good. And it is mankind that has come in over 100 years ago and thoroughly corrupted that. So absolutely, I agree with people like Wheat Belly, the grain deniers who say that bread is horrible for us because they're only talking about the fake bread, the fake flour that you buy from the store. And that's absolutely true. That is not life-giving. It will not help you. It's not going to help give you the fiber you need. It's not going to give you the nutrients you need. It's not going to give you anything that you need and possibly even cause you more health issues. But this is the grain, the food that God created us to eat. And if you're wondering how to get started with milling your grains, I highly suggest checking out our sponsor for this video, which is Pleasant Hill Grain. Pleasant Hill Grain is the one-stop shop to make it very easy for you to get started, because ultimately what you need to get started is you need some sort of grain mill and then you need some grains to start with. And Pleasant Hill Grain has it all. Not only do they have a huge selection of all the different grain mills that we have available to us, they also have the wheat berries, the grains that are the cleanest grains that I've ever seen, as well as your bread pans and your rollers and the yeast and anything else that you may need. So if you haven't already checked out Pleasant Hill Grain, do so by going to grainsandgrit.com/PHG. And really, it's that simple. Thanks to all of our modern technology, we now have electric grain mills. We now have mixers that can handle the heavy bread dough for us. It actually is not as much time as you may think. We even had bread machines that really help us. There's really no excuse these days to not be milling your own wheat and baking your bread. Hopefully this was helpful. And if y'all have any questions, please let me know in the comments below. And as always, y'all have a wonderful day, and I'll talk to you next week. Bye.